The operations floor was already loud when I put my headset on. Not loud in a chaotic way. Loud in the way a working mission always is. Multiple conversations layered on top of each other. Status checks, timing updates, calm voices moving fast. That was normal. I was seated at my station, eyes on the live feed tracking unit movement and listening to two channels at once. One was routine coordination. The other was the open operational channel shared across the task group. Nothing felt off, until it did. A voice cut through the chatter, casual and amused. "Commanders behind desks don't know anything." I froze. Not because the comment was shocking, but because I knew exactly who said it. My sister, Lieutenant Brooke Whitaker, didn't sound angry. She sounded entertained, like she was saying something clever to people she assumed were on her side. She followed it with a short laugh, the kind people use when they expect agreement. I didn't move. I didn't react. I didn't even blink. The open channel stayed live. No one interrupted her. No one corrected her. And that was the problem. She kept going, still light, still confident, talking about how real decisions were made on the operational side, not by someone watching screens all day. She never said my name. She didn't have to. Everyone on that channel knew who held command authority for this mission. Me. Brooke assumed I wasn't listening. Or worse, she assumed it didn't matter if I was. I glanced at the mission clock. Everything was running on schedule. Units were in position. Timelines were tight, but stable. I had seconds to decide how to respond if I was going to respond at all. This wasn't sibling trash talk at home. This wasn't sarcasm over coffee. This was an active operation shared across Allied units, logged and recorded. What she said wasn't just disrespectful, it undermined the chain of command in real time. If I ignored it, I'd be signaling that standards were optional. That rank only mattered when it was convenient, and everyone listening would take note. I kept my hands steady on the keyboard and opened the operations control panel. No announcement, no warning, no side conversation. I entered the directive. Remove Lieutenant Whitaker from the operation. Effective immediately. Pending review. I confirmed the order and sent it through the proper channel. The system accepted it without hesitation. That part was automatic. Authority either exists or it doesn't. In that moment, it did. On the main display, one of the unit indicators shifted status. Assigned role removed, task reassigned. The rest of the operation continued without interruption. Brooke's voice stopped mid-sentence. The channel stayed quiet for a beat too long. Then someone else spoke, picking up where the mission left off, like nothing unusual had happened. That's how these rooms work. The mission doesn't pause for personal drama. A liaison officer 2 stations over leaned slightly toward me. "Was that a change in tasking?" he asked. Neutral tone eyes still on his screen. "Yes," I said. "Minor adjustment." He nodded and turned back. That was it. No follow-up, no challenge, not here. I stayed focused on the display, but I could feel the shift around me. People weren't staring. They were avoiding eye contact. A few glances slid my way and then disappeared. Everyone understood what had just happened. They also understood why no one was going to comment on it out loud. Brooke hadn't just crossed a line. She'd crossed it publicly. I imagined the moment on her end. The sudden cutoff, the confusion. The realization that someone with actual authority had been listening the entire time. She would be demanding answers by now. Probably already calling it unfair. Probably already saying it was a joke. Jokes don't get logged in operational transcripts. Violations do. The mission moved forward. Updates kept coming in. Timelines adjusted. Fuel checks confirmed. The system didn't care about family relationships. It never does. As I monitored the next phase, a thought crossed my mind, uninvited and sharp. This was going to spread. Not just through the command structure, but beyond it. People talk, especially when something unusual happens, especially when last names match. I pushed the thought aside and stayed on task. That was the job. Feelings come later, if they come at all. A few minutes later, while things were stable, I leaned back just enough to take a breath. The room looked the same as it had before. Screens glowing, officers focused, coffee cups untouched. But I knew nothing was the same anymore. This wasn't just a professional call. It was a line drawn in permanent ink. Right here is usually where I pause for a second and ask you something. If you've ever been underestimated at work, especially by someone who should have known better, drop a comment below. I read them, and I'm curious how often this kind of thing happens outside the military. And if stories like this hit close to home, subscribing helps more than you think. I turned my attention back to the board as another update came in. The operation was still clean. No delays, no issues. Whatever fallout was coming wasn't going to happen here. It would happen later. I could already hear my phone vibrating in my pocket, even though it hadn't yet. Brooke would call, then my mother, then my father. The order of events was predictable. The arguments even more so. But none of that mattered in this room. In this space rank isn't about ego, it's about responsibility. When you're in command, you don't get to choose when standards apply. You enforce them every time, or they stop meaning anything. Brooke thought I was just another officer behind a desk. She thought my role was invisible. She thought her words were harmless. She was wrong on all 3 counts. I adjusted my headset and listened as the next report came through, already aware that the real consequences of what I'd done hadn't even started yet. I kept my eyes on the board and forced my breathing to stay even, because the worst thing I could do right now was look like I'd noticed the shift in the room. The operation rolled forward exactly as planned. Timelines stayed green, no alerts, no alarms. On paper, everything was fine. But the silence that followed Brooke's removal sat heavier than any raised voice ever could. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. It was the kind of quiet that only shows up when everyone understands something serious just happened, and no one wants to be the first to acknowledge it. I adjusted my headset and listened to the next update come in. A unit lead confirmed position. Another reported status normal. Professional. Controlled. Nobody mentioned the change. Nobody asked where Brooke went. That wasn't accidental. In rooms like this, people know when not to ask questions. Still, I could feel it. The sideways awareness. A few glances that stopped just short of my face. People weren't judging out loud, but they were definitely recalculating. Everyone was running the same mental math. She really did that, to her own sister. I'd been in command long enough to recognize the look. It wasn't anger. It wasn't admiration either. It was caution, the kind that says, I need to understand what kind of officer you are before I decide how close to stand. A liaison officer cleared his throat on the far side of the room and asked for a minor timeline adjustment. I answered without hesitation, walked him through the reasoning and approved it. My voice sounded steady. That mattered. In moments like this, the room follows the tone you set. If I showed uncertainty, it would spread. If I stayed calm, the room would settle. And it did. Gradually, people went back to work. Fingers moved faster over keyboards. Chairs stopped shifting. Conversations resumed at normal volume. The operation reclaimed the space. That's the thing about military environments. There's always another task waiting to fill the gap where emotion wants to sit. But just because the room moved on didn't mean the decision was over. I could already see the questions forming behind people's eyes. Was it necessary? Was it personal? Was it smart? Nobody was going to challenge me here, not during an active mission. But the judgment wouldn't stay contained to this floor. Last names have a way of traveling. I caught a brief reflection of myself in one of the darkened monitors. Same posture, same uniform, same controlled expression I'd worn through 100 briefings. From the outside, nothing looked different. On the inside, I was already mapping out the fallout. Brooke wasn't going to take this quietly. She never had. She was used to pushing boundaries and having someone smooth it over for her. A supervisor, a mentor, a family member. Someone always stepped in to reframe her mistakes as confidence or leadership potential. That safety net was gone now. Another update came in, and I acknowledged it with a nod. A few minutes later, a senior officer from one of the Allied units leaned back in his chair and glanced toward my station. He didn't speak to me directly. Instead, he addressed the room. "Let's keep comms tight," he said. "No commentary unless it's operationally relevant." It was subtle. It was also deliberate. No one argued. A few people nodded. The message was clear. Whatever just happened had crossed a line, and no one wanted to be associated with the wrong side of it. I didn't thank him. I didn't look up. I let the reminder stand on its own. The mission progressed into the next phase, and with it came a brief lull. Enough time for people to check phones. Enough time for thoughts to wander. That's when I felt it for real. The weight of what I'd done settling into my shoulders. Not regret, not guilt, awareness. I'd enforced a standard that couldn't be selectively applied. I knew that was the right call. I also knew it came with a price. In this environment, you don't pay it all at once. You pay it in looks and distance in conversations that stop when you enter a room. A junior officer passed behind me and hesitated just for a fraction of a second before continuing on. It wasn't disrespect. It was uncertainty. He was filing this away. Everyone was. The mission clock ticked forward. Another status update confirmed success on a minor objective. I acknowledged it and logged the note. Routine work has a way of grounding you. Numbers don't argue. Logs don't take sides. My phone vibrated once in my pocket. I ignored it. A few minutes later, it vibrated again. Longer this time. I didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. Brooke wouldn't wait. She never did. If she didn't get through to me, she'd start calling other people. Ops, admin, anyone she thought might reverse the decision. They wouldn't. Not now. I stayed focused on the display tracking movement and confirming checkpoints. The room felt tighter than before, like everyone was holding something back. Not hostility, curiosity. Another Allied officer leaned toward his colleague and whispered something I couldn't hear. The colleague glanced my way and then looked down at his notes. That was fine. Let them talk. Let them speculate. The facts would hold. I'd seen officers panic in moments like this. They over-explained. They tried to soften the edges. They wanted to be liked. That impulse ruins more careers than bad decisions ever will. I wasn't going to explain anything unless I was required to. Authority doesn't need commentary. The operation continued without incident. Objectives met, timelines adjusted. No one mentioned Brooke's name again. That absence said more than any argument could. By the time the next phase wrapped, the room had fully settled into its rhythm again. If someone walked in fresh, they'd have no idea anything unusual had occurred. That's how clean enforcement looks from the outside. Inside, I was already bracing for the next wave. Because what happens in a command center stays professional. What happens after people step away from it rarely does. My phone vibrated a third time, insistent now. I reached down, turned it face down against the desk, and kept my attention on the board as another update rolled in, fully aware that the consequences of my decision were no longer theoretical. My phone buzzed again before I even made it to the hallway, and this time I didn't flip it face down. I stepped away from the operations floor, found a quiet corner near the admin offices, and answered without looking at the screen. I already knew who it was. There are only so many people who call that fast, that often, when they think you've crossed an invisible line. What did you do to your sister? My mother didn't bother with hello. She never does when she thinks she's right. Her voice was sharp, already halfway through a verdict she'd decided on before dialing. I enforced protocol. I said keeping my voice level. She violated open comms during an active mission. There was a short, disbelieving laugh on the other end. Don't hide behind that. You embarrassed her. Do you have any idea how that looks? I leaned against the wall and stared at a framed evacuation map that hadn't been updated in years. "It looks like discipline," I said. "Which you'd understand if you'd heard what she said." "She was joking," my mother snapped. "That's how Brooke talks. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows." The phrase landed exactly the way it always had. Brooke's behavior was a known quantity, and that somehow made it acceptable. Predictable meant forgivable. It always had. "This wasn't a private conversation," I said. "It was logged, shared. Allied units were listening." "So what?" she shot back. "You couldn't pull her aside later. You had to make a show of it." I closed my eyes for a second. Not because I was tired, but because I'd had this argument in a dozen different versions my entire life. Same structure, same ending. Brooke crosses a line. I react. I'm told I overreacted. "There was no later," I said. In that moment, I was in command. There was a pause, then a softer voice came on the line. "Let me talk to her. My father." He didn't sound angry. That almost made it worse. "What happened?" he asked slower than my mother, like he was giving me a chance to fix it. "She undermined command authority on an open channel," I said. "I removed her from the operation." "You pulled her out in the middle of it," he said. "Not a question." "Yes." He exhaled long and heavy. "You don't do that to family." I felt something tighten in my chest, a familiar pressure I'd learned to ignore. "I didn't do it to family," I said. "I did it to an officer." "That's a convenient distinction," he replied. "But don't pretend this won't follow her. It follows the violation," I said, "not the person." Silence stretched between us. I could picture him sitting at the kitchen table back home, arms crossed, jaw set. He'd always measured service by proximity to danger. Boots on the ground, hands dirty. Anything else was support work in his eyes. "She puts her life on the line," he said finally. "What you do is important, sure, but it's not the same." There it was, the unspoken hierarchy laid out again. Brooke at the top. Me somewhere off to the side, useful but replaceable. "You think decisions don't carry weight because I'm not standing next to her?" I asked. "You think lives aren't affected by what I do?" "You're not the one out there," he said. "And you never will be." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how predictable it was. He'd said versions of that sentence since the day I chose my path. Brooke flew. I planned. One of us was brave. The other was smart. My mother jumped back in before I could respond. "You need to fix this," she said. "Call your sister. Explain yourself. Do something before this turns into a real problem." "It's already a real problem," I said. "And I'm not calling her." The line went quiet again. I knew what that silence meant. They weren't considering my position. They were recalibrating their disappointment. "You've always been like this," my mother said finally. "Rigid. You care more about rules than people." I looked down the hallway, watching two junior officers pass by, voices low, eyes forward. "No," I said. "I care about responsibility." I ended the call before either of them could say anything else. Not because I was angry, because the conversation wasn't going anywhere. It hadn't already been. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle. This was the part that never showed up in official reports. The part where the uniform doesn't protect you from being misunderstood by the people who are supposed to know you best. As I walked toward my office, memories I hadn't invited started surfacing. Family barbecues where Brooke's stories got retold louder each year. Neighbors nodding along as my parents bragged about her deployments, her confidence, her presence. My accomplishments mentioned briefly, usually followed by a comment about how I was more academic or better with details. I'd stopped correcting them years ago. It never changed anything. Inside my office, I set my cover on the desk and sat down, the chair creaking softly under my weight. The space was neat, controlled. The way I liked it. A place where cause and effect made sense. My phone buzzed again. This time I checked the screen. "Brooke." I didn't answer. A few seconds later, a message came through. Short, angry, accusing. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew the tone. I'd heard it my whole life whenever something didn't go her way. Another vibration followed, then another. Calls stacking up. Messages piling on. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling for a moment, counting my breaths. This wasn't about smoothing things over. It never had been. The moment I'd enforced that order, I'd stepped out of the role my family preferred me in. They liked me better when I stayed quiet, when I absorbed the tension, when I let Brooke be the one who mattered. I pushed my chair back and stood up just as a knock hit the door sharp and impatient. I didn't have to ask who it was. Brooke never knocked gently. I crossed the room and opened the door, fully aware that whatever she was about to say wouldn't stay contained to this space, and that for the first time, no one was going to step in and soften the impact for either of us. I stepped aside as the door swung open, and Brooke walked in like she owned the space. She didn't wait for permission. She never did. Her uniform was still crisp, flight jacket, half-zipped hair pulled back tighter than usual. Her jaw was locked, eyes sharp with the kind of anger that comes from being told no for the first time. She shut the door behind her with more force than necessary and stood there staring at me like I'd personally sabotaged her life. "What the hell was that?" she said. I didn't sit down. I stayed where I was, hands relaxed at my sides, giving her my full attention without giving her control of the room. "That was a removal from an active operation," I said, "logged and authorized." She let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "Don't talk to me like I'm one of your subordinates. I'm your sister." I met her eyes. "You were an officer on an open channel." Her expression flickered just slightly. "So that's it. One comment and you nuke my role. You've got to be kidding me." "It wasn't one comment," I said. "And it wasn't private." She stepped closer, voice rising. "It was a joke. Everyone jokes. You think the people out there don't talk? You think they don't blow off steam? They don't do it on an open channel," I said. "Not during a mission." Brooke scoffed. "You're really going to pretend this isn't personal?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't have one, but because rushing to fill silence only benefits the loudest person in the room. She took that as an opening. "You've been waiting for this," she continued. "Ever since I started getting real assignments. Ever since people actually started paying attention to me. You finally get some authority, and you use it to pull me down." "That's not what happened," I said. She pointed at my desk. "You sit behind screens, and you think that makes you the final word. You don't see what it's like out there. You don't feel it. And somehow, that gives you the right to wreck my reputation. In front of everyone, I kept my voice even. Your reputation isn't my responsibility. Your conduct is." Her face flushed. "You embarrassed me." "You embarrassed yourself," I said. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were harsh, but because they were simple. Brooke opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly not used to someone refusing to soften the blow. "You know what everyone's saying right now," she snapped. "They're saying you pulled me because you couldn't stand being mocked, that you took it personally. They can say whatever they want," I said. "The log says otherwise." She laughed again, louder this time. "You really think hiding behind paperwork makes you untouchable?" I took a step forward, closing the distance just enough to reset the balance. "I didn't remove my sister," I said. "I removed an officer who violated comms discipline during a live mission." Her smile vanished. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of the building filled the gap. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. Life went on. "You don't get to decide that," she said finally. "Not about me." "I already did," I replied. And it wasn't a decision, it was a requirement. She shook her head slowly, like she was trying to make sense of a language she didn't want to learn. "You really don't care what this does to me, do you?" "I care about the mission," I said, "and the people who depend on it." "That's a nice way to dodge the question," she said. "You always do that. You talk like a manual when things get uncomfortable." I almost smiled at that. "Almost. And you talk like the rules don't apply to you." Her shoulders tensed. "Because they usually don't," she said. Then stopped. The realization crossed her face a split second too late. She knew she'd said it out loud, knew she'd confirmed exactly why this had happened. I didn't pounce on it. I didn't need to. The silence did the work for me. You think this place runs on favors, I asked? On last names? She looked away, jaw clenched. I think people understand context. They understand standards, I said. Or they should. Brooke turned back toward me, eyes blazing. You think this makes you some kind of hero, pulling your own sister? No, I said. I think it makes me responsible. She took a sharp breath, pacing the room. Now hands flexing at her sides. You have no idea what it's like to be out there and suddenly have everything pulled out from under you. I know exactly what it's like, I said. It's what happens when you assume someone else will clean up after you. She stopped pacing and faced me again. You've always been jealous. That one didn't land. It never had. Of what I asked. Your confidence or your immunity? She flinched. You don't get to talk to me like that. I do, I said. Right now I do. Her breathing was shallow fast. For a second, I thought she might say something she couldn't take back. Instead, she grabbed the back of the chair nearest my desk and leaned on it knuckles white. You've made enemies today, she said. People are going to remember this. They already are, I replied. And that's fine. She straightened, pulling her jacket closed like armor. You really think Mom and Dad are going to be okay with this? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She already knew. They're furious, she said. They think you've crossed a line. I know. You could still fix this. She pressed. Say it was a misunderstanding. Walk it back. I shook my head once. I can't. You won't, she corrected. I met her gaze. I won't. For the first time since she walked in, something in her expression shifted. Not anger, not defiance, uncertainty. The kind that shows up when someone realizes the usual levers aren't working. She picked up her cover from the chair and headed for the door, stopping with her hand on the handle. You think you've won, she said quietly. I didn't respond. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving it ajar behind her. I watched her walk away, boots striking the floor with sharp, uneven steps, and felt the weight of what had just happened settle fully into place. There were no raised voices echoing down the hall. No witnesses rushing in. Just the clean aftermath of a boundary finally enforced, and the knowledge that nothing between us would ever fall back into its old pattern again. I closed the door she left ajar and stood there longer than I needed to, hand still on the knob, listening to her footsteps fade down the hall. The office felt smaller once she was gone, not because of the space, but because there was nothing left to manage. No mission feed, no radio traffic. Just the quiet you get when the adrenaline drains and leaves you alone with thoughts you usually keep buried. I went back to my desk and sat down not to work, but because sitting gave my hands something to do. I straightened a stack of papers that didn't need straightening and lined my pen up with the edge of the desk. That habit went back a long way. Control the small things when you can't control the rest. My eyes drifted to the bookshelf across from me. Binders, manuals, old training material. I should have archived years ago. And tucked between two thick folders was something that didn't belong there. A thin, worn envelope. I hadn't opened it in a long time. Not because it hurt too much, but because it didn't need revisiting. Or so I told myself. I pulled it out and slid the contents onto the desk. Inside were things my parents had kept and passed on without much thought. A few old certificates, a faded newspaper clipping, and a drawing on yellowed paper edges, curled from being handled too many times. Brooke had drawn it when she was 8. She was front and center stick figure, confident, standing on top of something she'd labeled my mission. She had wings, a helmet, a big smile. Next to her was another figure, smaller, holding a clipboard. No face, no label. That was me. I remembered the day she brought it home. My mother had taped it to the fridge like it was a prophecy. Everyone laughed. She knows what she wants. My dad had said, ruffling Brooke's hair. No one asked what I wanted. That was how it always went. Brooke was loud, confident, comfortable taking up space. When she talked, people listened. When she made mistakes, they were brushed off as growing pains. Signs of leadership, even. I was the quiet one, the one who finished homework early, the one teachers praised for being reliable, the one adults nodded at and then forgot 5 minutes later. When Brooke won her first school award, my parents threw a barbecue. Neighbors came. Stories got told. When I placed first in a regional academic competition, the same year my mom hugged me and said, "That's nice, honey," before asking Brooke if she wanted more soda. I learned early which moments were worth sharing and which ones weren't. By the time high school rolled around, the roles were locked in. Brooke was the athlete, the risk taker, the one people expected things from. I was the backup plan, the smart one, the safe one. When I told my parents I was joining the Navy, my mother blinked like she hadn't heard me right. My father nodded once and said, "Figures." Then he asked Brooke how her driving lessons were going. She got a used car for graduation. I got a handshake. I didn't resent Brooke for that. Not really. You can't hate someone for accepting what's handed to them. But I did resent the way the system around her bent to keep her comfortable. The way mistakes turned into stories. The way confidence was rewarded even when it crossed into arrogance. At officer training, I learned fast that the military didn't work like my family did. Standards applied evenly, at least on paper. Performance mattered. Preparation mattered. Quiet competence wasn't flashy, but it counted. I thrived there, not because I was exceptional, but because I was consistent. I listened, I planned, I followed through. While others chased attention, I learned how systems worked, how decisions moved people and resources, how one missed detail could unravel an entire operation. Brooke loved to tease me about it when we talked back then. "You always liked rules," she'd say. I'd go crazy sitting where you sit. I let it slide. I always did. Even as my career progressed and my responsibilities grew, the family narrative never changed. Brooke was still the one really serving. I was still the one supporting. At holidays, my parents introduced her with pride. "She's out there doing the real work," my dad would say. When people asked about me, he'd add, "She's more behind the scenes." Behind the scenes, like it was a footnote. I stopped correcting them because it never landed. Explaining your value to people who've already decided where you fit is exhausting. So I let my work speak where they couldn't hear it. That drawing stayed with me through moves and deployments, folded and refolded, until the creases threatened to split. Not because I wanted to remember being overlooked, but because it reminded me of something important. This dynamic didn't start yesterday. It didn't start on that open channel. It was built over years of unchallenged assumptions. Brooke grew up believing she was untouchable. I grew up learning how to operate without protection. Looking back now, that difference shaped everything. She expected someone to intervene when things went wrong. I never did. I slid the drawing back into the envelope and set it aside, not with anger, but with clarity. The confrontation in my office hadn't come out of nowhere. It was the natural collision of two paths that had been diverging since childhood. Brooke didn't see my authority because she'd never been taught to. My parents didn't respect it because it didn't match their image of service. And I'd spent too long letting that slide because it was easier than pushing back. That ended the moment I typed that order. A knock sounded at the door lighter this time. Not Brooke. I straightened the envelope and tucked it back onto the shelf before calling out, "Come in!" A junior officer stepped inside, postured, her stiff eyes careful. "Ma'am," he said, "admin just flagged a note regarding the operation. They're requesting confirmation on the change in tasking." "Send it through," I said. "I'll respond." "Yes, ma'am." He hesitated for half a second, then added, "For what it's worth. Things stayed clean out there." I nodded. That's the goal. He left, closing the door quietly behind him. I pulled my chair back in and opened the admin channel, fingers already moving. There were forms to answer, logs to confirm, questions that had nothing to do with family and everything to do with procedure. This was the part I understood. As I typed, I felt something settle into place. Not relief, not vindication, just alignment. For the first time, the expectations placed on me and the standards I lived by were the same. And whatever came next, it was going to play out on those terms. The request from admin landed in my inbox before I'd finished my reply, flagged with the kind of neutral language that meant it wasn't optional. I read it once, then again, not because I didn't understand it, but because seeing it in writing made everything real in a different way. An administrative review. Standard procedure. Independent panel, timeline to be determined. No accusations, no conclusions, just verification. That was how the military handled situations like this. Quietly, methodically, with enough distance to strip emotion out of the equation. I forwarded the notice to my command and acknowledged receipt. No commentary, no explanation. I didn't need to defend myself yet. This wasn't that stage. By the time I walked into the review room 2 days later, the initial shock had worn off and been replaced by something colder. Focus. The room was plain, intentionally so. No flags on the walls, no unit insignia, just a long table, 3 chairs on one side, one on the other. 3 officers were already seated when I entered. None of them wore U.S. Navy insignia. That was deliberate. One was British, one Canadian, one Dutch. Allied officers chosen specifically to avoid any hint of internal bias. I took the chair opposite them and set my folder on the table. "Commander Whitaker," the British officer said, nodding once. "This review is to confirm that your decision to remove Lieutenant Whitaker from the operation was based solely on operational necessity." "I understand," I said. The Canadian officer leaned forward slightly. "You're aware that your familial relationship requires additional scrutiny?" "Yes." No one looked surprised. This wasn't new territory for them, just uncomfortable. The Dutch officer slid a printed transcript across the table. "This is the excerpt from the open channel," he said. "Time-stamped and verified." I glanced at it without touching it. I already knew what it said. "That's correct. You acted within minutes of the statement," the British officer continued. "Why not address it after the operation concluded?" "Because the violation occurred during the operation," I said. "Allowing it to stand would have undermined command authority in real time." The Canadian officer raised an eyebrow. "Even though the officer in question was your sister?" "Especially because she was my sister," I said. That earned me a pause. Not skepticism. Consideration. "Explain," the Dutch officer said. "If I had delayed action, I said everyone on that channel would have assumed personal favoritism. Discipline doesn't work if it only applies to people you're not related to." The British officer made a note, but didn't look down as he wrote. "Was there any attempt to warn her prior to removal?" "No," I said. "The protocol doesn't require one." "Did you consider the impact on her career?" "I considered the impact on the operation," I said. "Career consequences are a byproduct of conduct, not the criteria for enforcement." The Canadian officer folded his hands. "Some would argue that removal was excessive for a verbal remark." It wasn't a remark, I said. It was an open channel violation that questioned the legitimacy of command, in a joint environment that creates confusion and risk. The room stayed quiet for a few seconds. No one interrupted. No one challenged the statement. The Dutch officer tapped the transcript lightly. "Do you believe your decision would have been the same if the officer had a different last name?" "Yes." "How can you be certain?" "Because I've done it before," I said. "Not under identical circumstances, but for the same category of violation." That was true. I'd relieved officers from roles for less. The difference was that none of those decisions followed me home. The British officer finally picked up the transcript and read a line out loud, voice flat. Commanders behind desks don't know anything. He looked up. Would you consider that a challenge to authority? Yes. Would you consider it damaging to cohesion if left unaddressed? Yes. The Canadian officer exhaled quietly, leaned back in his chair. You're aware this decision has caused friction. I am. And you're comfortable with that. I'm comfortable with the standard being clear, I said. Discomfort isn't a reason to ignore it. No one smiled, no one frowned. That was a good sign. They asked about the timing, the reassignment process, whether I had sole authority or shared sign-off. I answered everything directly citing procedures, not opinions. The folder on the table stayed closed. They didn't need it yet. At one point, the Dutch officer asked, Did you consider recusing yourself and deferring the decision to another authority? Yes, I said, and I rejected that option. Why? Because delay would have signaled uncertainty. I said, in an active operation that's more damaging than decisive enforcement. The British officer nodded once, slow. Thank you. The review wrapped without ceremony. No conclusions announced, no reassurance offered. Just a polite dismissal and the quiet understanding that my answers would be weighed against the record. As I stood to leave, the Canadian officer spoke again. For what it's worth, he said, tone neutral. This panel isn't here to planche correct decisions. I know, I said. Walking back down the corridor, I felt the tension in my shoulders finally shift. Not disappear. Shift. There's a difference. The review wasn't a threat. It was a test. And like most tests in the military, it wasn't about how you felt. It was about whether your actions held up when stripped of context. Back in my office, I closed the door and sat down staring at the inbox that had already filled with routine updates. The world hadn't stopped while I was in that room. It never does. A message from admin blinked at the top of the list. Acknowledgement received. Review ongoing. No action required at this time. I archived it and moved on. Outside the base hummed with its usual rhythm. Vehicles passed. Voices echoed faintly down the hall. Somewhere, Brooke was probably telling her version of the story to anyone who would listen. Somewhere else, my parents were still convinced I'd gone too far. None of that showed up in the documentation. What mattered now was that every word I'd spoken in that room was backed by process precedent and record. There were no gaps to fill with emotion, no gray areas to spin into something else. I opened the mission logs again and scanned through them, eyes moving automatically, noting how clean the timeline still looked. The operation had held. The system had absorbed the disruption and kept going. That was the quiet proof I trusted. I leaned back in my chair, letting the hum of the building settle around me, fully aware that while the review wasn't finished, the foundation beneath my decision wasn't going anywhere. The notification came through while I was mid-sentence on a routine coordination call, and I let it sit there until I finished speaking. I didn't rush to open it. That would have been out of character, and more importantly, unnecessary. Whatever the panel decided wasn't going to change based on how quickly I clicked. When the call ended, I muted my headset, turned back to my desk, and opened the message with the same steady motion I used for everything else. Administrative review complete. Action validated. No further steps required. That was it. No congratulations, no commentary, just a clean line closing the loop. I read it once and archived it. Not because it didn't matter, but because the military doesn't reward lingering. Decisions get made documented and then folded into the larger system. That's how you know they're real. I sat there for a moment, hands resting flat on the desk, letting the weight of it register in my body before my mind caught up. The review hadn't softened the outcome. It hadn't split hairs or added qualifiers. It had simply confirmed what the process already said. I had acted within authority. I had enforced protocol. I had not crossed a line. What surprised me wasn't the verdict. It was the absence of anything else. No follow-up meeting. No warning about optics. No suggestion that I could have handled it differently. The system had done what it was designed to do and moved on. People didn't. The shift was subtle at first. A change in tone during briefings. Fewer sideways glances. Conversations that didn't pause when I walked into a room. No one pulled me aside to apologize for doubting me. That doesn't happen here. Respect in this environment shows up in smaller ways. A senior officer from another unit stopped me in the hallway later that day. Saw the review cleared, he said, voice casual. "Clean work." I nodded, "Thanks." That was it. No handshake, no backslapping. Just acknowledgement. It carried more weight than any speech ever could. Not everyone was comfortable, though. A few people still kept their distance, like they weren't sure which version of me they were dealing with. The commander who enforced discipline without hesitation, or the sister who had crossed an invisible line. I didn't try to clarify it for them. That wasn't my job. What mattered was that the standard had held. The same standard everyone claimed to believe in when it applied to someone else. Later that afternoon, I caught sight of Brooke across the base. She was standing near admin arms, crossed posture stiff. She didn't see me at first. When she did, her expression tightened, then flattened into something unreadable. She didn't approach. Neither did I. That was new. For years, Brooke had moved through spaces like they belonged to her. Confident. Unquestioned. That ease was gone now. Not completely, but enough that it showed. Word had reached her. It always does. Reviews don't stay quiet for long, even when the details do. She knew the decision stood. She knew no one was coming to undo it. That realization hits different when you've spent your life assuming the system bends. I went back to my office and closed the door finally, allowing myself a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Not relief. More like confirmation. The kind you feel when something lines up exactly the way you knew it would, and the noise around it finally fades. My phone buzzed once on the desk. A text from my mother. "So that's it then. No question mark. No apology. Just a statement heavy with disappointment." I didn't respond. Another message followed a few minutes later. "Your father says you made your point." I stared at the screen, then locked it and set the phone face down. That was as close as I was going to get to acknowledgement, and we all knew it. In their eyes, I hadn't done the right thing. I'd just done something they couldn't undo. That distinction mattered more to them than whether I was correct. I turned back to my computer and pulled up the next day's briefing materials. There were routes to review supply updates to confirm, and a coordination call with allied units scheduled for the morning. The work didn't pause because my personal life was messy. It never had. During the evening briefing, no one challenged my authority. No one tested boundaries. Comms stayed clean. Reports stayed tight. The ripple from Brooke's comment had been absorbed, neutralized, and forgotten by the operation itself. That's what discipline does when it works. It prevents one person's ego from becoming everyone else's problem. After the briefing wrapped, a junior officer lingered by the door, shifting his weight like he wasn't sure if he should speak. I waited. "Ma'am," he said finally. "I just wanted to say, people noticed what I asked. That you didn't back down," he said. "A lot of folks talk about standards. Not everyone enforces them." I nodded once. "Standards aren't real if they're optional." He smiled just slightly and left. I sat there alone after that office quiet, except for the hum of the building, and let the day settle. The review was over. The decision stood. Nothing dramatic had happened as a result. No doors slammed. No careers ended in a blaze of controversy. And yet everything felt different. Not because I'd been vindicated, but because a line had been drawn and held. The system had chosen clarity over comfort. That choice has a way of exposing where people really stand. I glanced once more at my phone, still face down on the desk, and turned my attention back to the work in front of me, aware that while the review had closed cleanly, the consequences of enforcing that standard were still moving quietly through the spaces I occupied. I spotted Brooke's name missing from the rotation board the next morning, and I didn't stop walking. The hallway outside Ops was busy people moving with coffee cups and folders, trading quick updates before briefings. The board updated overnight like it always did, names, shifting assignments, tightening. Brooke's usual slot was gone. Not crossed out, not highlighted, just absent. That's how changes like this happen when the system decides to move on without you. I took my seat for the morning brief and kept my focus on the agenda. Routes, timelines, resource constraints, the usual. No one mentioned Brooke, no one needed to. The board had already said enough. During the briefing, a unit lead asked for clarification on a task Brooke had handled before. Another officer answered without hesitation, already assigned. Clean handoff, no confusion. The operation didn't stumble. It never does when the paperwork is right. Afterward, I crossed the courtyard toward admin, the air cool and sharp. I heard Brooke before I saw her. Her voice carried in short bursts, tight, and controlled the way she spoke when she was trying not to lose it. She stood at the counter with a folded notice in her hand. Shoulders squared like posture alone could push back reality. Reassignment pending, she said to the clerk, tapping the paper. Pending what exactly? The clerk didn't look rattled. He'd handled worse. Pending completion of the administrative process, ma'am. That process is done, Brooke said. The review cleared. Yes, ma'am, he replied. This action is separate. Separate. That word tends to land hard when you're used to everything being connected in your favor. I didn't step closer. I didn't interrupt. I watched from where I was not out of satisfaction, but because this was the first time Brooke was hearing the word no from someone who wasn't going to bend. What does separate mean? She pressed. It means your operational assignment has changed, the clerk said. You'll receive new orders shortly. Brooke exhaled through her nose, a sound halfway between disbelief and anger. You're sidelining me. The clerk shrugged professional. You're being reassigned. She turned away sharply, scanning the space like she was looking for someone else to argue with. When her eyes landed on me, she froze. For a second, I saw something raw there. Not rage, not arrogance, shock. She walked over slow and deliberate, the paper clenched in her hand. You knew about this, she said. I knew it was possible, I replied. Her laugh came out flat. Possible? You always talk like that, like this stuff just happens. This stuff happens when records follow behavior, I said. She shook her head. They're pulling me from everything that matters. No more rotations, no more lead roles. Not right now, I said. She stared at me, searching for something. Guilt, maybe, regret. An apology. I gave her none of it. This isn't fair, she said. I didn't do anything that bad. I kept my voice level. You challenged command authority on a live channel, she scoffed, and that's enough to tank my career. It's enough to change it, I said. What happens next depends on you. She looked away, jaw tight. You always talk like consequences are some abstract concept. They're not abstract, I said. They're just not personal. She turned back to me, then eyes sharp again. Easy for you to say. You're still sitting where you always sit. That seat didn't protect me, I said. The process did. We stood there for a moment, the noise of the courtyard moving around us. Boots on concrete, voices passing, life continuing. Brooke's grip on the paper loosened slightly, like her hands were finally catching up to the message. This isn't how it was supposed to go, she said quietly. No, I said. It's how it did. Later that afternoon, her name disappeared from another list. Then another. Tasks reassigned. Meetings removed from her calendar. No announcement, no spectacle. The kind of fall that doesn't make noise because no one pushes you. They just stop catching you. I heard from a mutual contact that her crew hadn't protested. No one filed a complaint. No one made calls on her behalf. That detail mattered more than anything else. It meant the room had already recalibrated its loyalty. People don't abandon leaders when they're punished unfairly. They abandon them when they recognize a pattern they've been tolerating. By evening, Brooke showed up at my office again. This time, she knocked. I opened the door and stepped aside. She came in slower than before, shoulders slumped just enough to be noticeable. The bravado was gone. In its place was something more dangerous: confusion. "They're sending me stateside," she said, holding up the notice. "Training command, no operational lead." "That's still service," I said. She laughed once bitter. "You know what I mean." I did. She'd built her identity around being indispensable, around being the one people needed in the moment. Training roles don't scratch that itch. "They're acting like I'm a liability," she said. "They're acting like they need predictability," I replied. She paced the room, then stopped facing me. "Say it," she said. "You wanted this." "No," I said. "I wanted the channel clean." That's not the same thing, she shot back. "It is when you're in charge," I said. She stared at me for a long moment, then dropped into the chair across from my desk, like her legs had finally given out. "They looked relieved," she said quietly. "Who my crew?" she said, when the order came through. Not angry, not confused, relieved. The word hung there heavier than any accusation. "I didn't see that coming," she added. I nodded once. "Most people don't." She rubbed her face with both hands, dragging them down slowly. "I always thought you'd cover for me." "I know I said." She looked up. "You didn't." "No," I said. "I didn't." The room fell quiet again, not tense this time, just honest. Brooke sat there staring at the floor, the paper slack in her hand, the weight of a system finally pressing back. Outside, the base lights clicked on one by one as evening settled in, and I stood there across from her, fully aware that the version of Brooke who'd walked into my office before didn't exist anymore. I didn't tell my parents about the recognition. I didn't mention it to Brooke either. There was no reason to. In my experience, the things that matter most tend to speak loudest when you don't announce them. The notice came through the same way everything else had since the review ended. Calm, administrative, a line item on my schedule that looked no different from any other obligation. Joint leadership briefing. Attendance required, followed by a short block marked recognition. No ceremony, no audience invited, just work. The room was already half full when I walked in. Flags lined one wall, muted colors under overhead lights. Officers from different services sat scattered across the tables, laptops open, conversations low. I took my seat, nodded to a few familiar faces, and opened my notes. The briefing ran long. It always does. Updates, adjustments, quiet disagreements handled without drama. I spoke when it was my turn and stopped when it wasn't. Nothing about the room felt charged. If anything, it felt settled. When the final slide closed, the senior officer at the head of the table stood and cleared his throat. "Before we break," he said, "there's one item to address." I didn't look up right away. Neither did anyone else. "We want to acknowledge decisive leadership during a recent joint operation," he continued. "Maintaining command discipline under pressure prevented broader disruption and kept the mission on track." A few heads turned. Still no applause. That wasn't the culture. "Commander Lauren Whitaker," he said, glancing in my direction. "Thank you for holding the line." That was it. A handful of nods followed. One officer offered a quiet "well done" as chairs scraped back. No one clapped. No one made a show of it. Respect here doesn't come with noise. I gathered my things and stepped into the hallway, feeling lighter than I expected. Not triumphant, just clear. The kind of clarity that comes when effort meets acknowledgement without argument. Later that afternoon, I received a message I hadn't anticipated. "Family dinner this weekend. Your father wants everyone there. No punctuation, no explanation, just expectation." I didn't respond right away. I didn't need time to think about whether I would go. I knew I would. Avoidance would only feed the version of the story they preferred. Presence quiet and unyielding was more effective. The house looked the same as it always had. Trim lawn, familiar porch, the kind of place people assume produces simple narratives. I parked, stepped out, and walked up without rehearsing anything. Brooke was already inside when I arrived. I could tell by the way the room felt before I even saw her. Tighter, more cautious. She stood near the kitchen counter, arms crossed, eyes flicking up when I entered, and then away again. My mother greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. My father nodded once, neutral. Dinner unfolded the way these things always do. Small talk, weather, neighbors, nothing substantial. Brooke barely spoke. When she did, it was clipped careful. The confidence that used to fill every corner of the room had retreated into something guarded. At one point, my father cleared his throat. "We heard you had some kind of acknowledgement at work," he said. My mother shot him a look sharp enough to cut. "It was routine," I said. Still, he pressed. "Sounds like they appreciated how you handled things. That was new. Not praise." "Not exactly. But recognition of reality." I nodded. They appreciated that the operation stayed intact. Silence followed. Not awkward, just unoccupied. Brooke stared at her plate. My mother shifted in her chair like she wanted to redirect the conversation and couldn't find the angle. My father picked up his fork, then set it down again. No one argued, no one defended Brooke, no one asked me to explain myself. That was the moment. For years, dinners like this ended with someone making a joke at my expense, or praising Brooke just loudly enough to remind me where I stood. Tonight, there was nothing to add. The narrative they'd relied on had collapsed under its own weight. After dessert, Brooke stood up and excused herself, stepping out onto the porch without looking at anyone. I didn't follow her, not because I didn't care, but because this wasn't a scene that needed managing. My mother hovered by the sink, hands busy with nothing. "You didn't have to be so hard on her," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "I wasn't hard on her," I replied. "I was consistent." She sighed, the sound of someone realizing an argument wouldn't land. "She's having a rough time." "I know," I said. So did I. That ended it. When I stood to leave, my father walked me to the door. He didn't put a hand on my shoulder. He didn't apologize. He just said, "Drive safe." I nodded and stepped into the night air, the porch light humming softly behind me. As I walked to my car, I felt something loosen that I hadn't known was still tight. Back on base the next week, the atmosphere was different. Not warm, not friendly, but settled. People greeted me directly now. Questions were asked without hesitation. Decisions weren't second-guessed for sport. A junior officer caught up to me after a briefing. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his voice. "Can I ask you something?" I stopped. "Sure." "Does it ever get easier?" he asked. "Holding people accountable when they don't expect it." I thought about Brooke's face when she realized no one was stepping in. About my parents' silence at dinner. About the way the room had gone quiet when my name was called. "No," I said. "But it gets cleaner." He nodded, satisfied, and walked off. I returned to my office and closed the door, setting my cover on the desk the same way I always did. The recognition sat in my inbox, already archived. The dinner sat in my memory, resolved without confrontation. Quiet revenge doesn't look like victory laps. It looks like rooms where no one challenges you anymore. Tables where people stop rewriting the story. It looks like silence that finally works in your favor. I opened the next briefing file and started reading, fully aware that nothing about my role had changed. And that was exactly the point. I adjusted my uniform in the mirror that morning, not because anything was out of place, but because habits like that keep you grounded. The base was already awake when I stepped outside. Vehicles moved in steady patterns. Conversations overlapped without urgency. Another normal day built on routines most people never notice. That was the part I'd always appreciated. When you do your job well, nothing looks dramatic from the outside. I walked into the briefing room and took my seat without scanning for reactions. I didn't need to anymore. The room had settled into a new understanding. Orders were followed, questions were direct. No one tested the edges to see how far they could push. That change hadn't come from speeches or recognition. It came from consistency. The briefing ended on time, assignments confirmed, timelines locked. As people filed out, a few officers nodded in passing. Not admiration, acceptance. The kind that matters. Back in my office, I finally opened the letter that had been sitting in my drawer for days. Brooke's handwriting was unmistakable, tighter than usual, controlled like she'd rewritten each sentence twice before committing. You were right. I didn't think the rules applied to me. I thought blood meant protection. I didn't realize what it looked like until no one defended me. The letter wasn't long. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't try to rewrite the past. It simply acknowledged something she'd never admitted before. Accountability. I folded it once and set it back in the drawer, not with relief, but with perspective. An apology doesn't erase years of imbalance. It doesn't undo the way our family leaned. But it mattered that she'd reached the point where she could see it. That didn't mean things would be easy between us. It just meant they'd be honest, or they'd be nothing at all. Later that week, my mother called. Her tone was different, not softer, more careful. She's struggling, she said. I know, I replied. She says you won't talk to her. I didn't say that I said I won't pretend nothing happened. Silence followed. Then quietly, your father read the letter. I didn't ask what he thought. I already knew. Understanding doesn't come easily to people who've spent decades convinced they were right. I'm not asking you to fix things, my mother said. I just wanted you to know. That's enough, I said. After the call ended, I sat for a moment and let the office noise fill the space again. Phones ringing, footsteps in the hall. Life moving forward without waiting for emotional closure. That was the lesson I'd learned the hard way. Closure isn't something you get handed. It's something you choose to stop chasing. Over the next few weeks, Brooke's reassignment became official. Training command, structured environment, less spotlight, more oversight. I heard she was doing well, quietly. No complaints, no excuses. People adapt when they realize no one is coming to save them. At work, my responsibilities expanded. Not dramatically. Just enough to signal trust. More coordination. More oversight. The kind of growth that doesn't need announcement because it shows up in your calendar before it ever shows up in conversation. One afternoon, a lieutenant I'd worked with briefly stopped by my office. He hesitated at the door, then stepped in. Ma'am, he said, can I ask you something off the record? I nodded. Go ahead. How do you deal with it? He asked. When people you care about think you're wrong, even when you know you're not. I considered the question longer than I usually would. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because it deserved an honest one. You stop needing them to agree, I said, and you start making sure you can live with your decisions when no one's watching. He nodded, absorbing it, and left without another word. That evening, I walked the perimeter path as the sun dipped low, the air cooling just enough to be noticeable. I thought about the girl I'd been standing next to a fridge, with a drawing taped to it, already learning where she fit. I thought about the officer I'd become standing in rooms where silence carried more weight than applause. I didn't regret the order. Not for a second. It wasn't revenge in the way people usually mean it. There was no satisfaction in watching Brooke struggle. No joy in my parents' discomfort. The victory, if you could call it that, came from refusing to shrink to make things easier for them. In the military, leadership isn't about being liked. It's about being trusted when things get uncomfortable, especially when the pressure comes from directions you don't expect. I reached my quarters, set my cover down, and loosened my collar, letting the day finally end. The plaque from recognition sat on the desk, turned face down. Not hidden, just not center stage. What mattered wasn't the acknowledgement. It was the quiet shift that followed. The absence of jokes on open channels, the steadiness in briefings, the understanding that standards weren't suggestions. Family didn't define my authority. My decisions did. As I prepared for the next day, I realized something I hadn't before. The hardest line to hold isn't against an enemy or a deadline. It's the one you draw when the people crossing it share your last name. And once you draw it, you don't need to defend it. You just keep showing up, doing the work, and letting the silence speak for you. If stories like this resonate with you, especially real military stories and family revenge stories rooted in discipline and accountability, make sure you subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming, and you won't want to miss them.